Well, thank you, Laura. And before I welcome Dave, I'd like to welcome everybody who's online. I see there's more than 60 participants and probably there are a few more joining. So thank you for taking the time and for joining us on this Archbold seminar. We took a bit of time to get this going because we were going to do it in the summer and had to postpone it, and then decided, well, we're just going to do it virtually. We'll go for it. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dave Onorato, who, as Laura said, works for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. A little background on Dave. He's actually from Pennsylvania, and he started off his academic career at Eckerd College in Florida, and then went on a sort of transcontinental migration for graduate work, starting off in Alabama. And he got a PhD from Oklahoma State, and then he went and did some postdoc work at the University of Idaho. And during that period, he built great expertise in a field known as conservation genetics, with a particular focus on large carnivores, so the conservation genetics of large carnivores. And in 2005, he was headhunted and recruited into Florida and joined the Florida Panther project for the Fish and Wildlife Commission here in Florida. And I'm going to let him describe what he's been doing there. But I could say personally from Archbold, it's really wonderful to have you here, Dave, specifically as, you know, very early on, our former director, Jim Lane, was really in at the outset of Panther work and Panther conservation in Florida. We had long working relationships with Dave Mayer. We've had a lot of work with predator and prey. And I'll let everyone know on the line that I'm delighted to let everyone know we're about to start up our predator prey program again. And we'll be inviting Joe Guthrie to join us in the next couple of days to reinitiate some work. So your contribution is very welcome and very timely for us at the minute. The title of Dave's talk is 4 decades of research on the Florida Panther, from the edge of extinction to population. And at that point, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Hillary, for that introduction. And just before I get started, I want to make sure you guys can see the correct slide, title slide, because I have 2 monitors, so I just want to make sure.
Yes, it looks good. It's full screen.
It's full screen. That was my question. Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, as Hillary mentioned, I'm one of the panther biologists for FWC on the Florida Panther project. And today I'll be talking to you about 4 decades of research that we at the state level have been conducting on panthers since the project started in 1981, and be going over a whole kind of history of a little bit of large carnivore management, and then moving on to, of course, the panther and kind of the ups and downs of the population that we've witnessed during the project, and then kind of closing out with some more recent research we've started up on panthers north of the Caloosahatchee River, and then a subsequent neurological disorder we recently documented in the population. So we'll cover a lot of ground. Hopefully I won't bore people too much with too many details, but yeah, so first of all, to start out, research and management of large carnivores, it kind of plays a really pivotal role in these animals because typically their populations are either threatened or endangered. So large carnivores throughout the world are in decline for the most part, no matter where you are, whether it's North America, Africa, Europe. Kind of the same story goes in all those places with their population numbers. And so learning, getting information from research helps management and how management decisions are made. It also helps us get a better understanding of how humans interact with large carnivores. As you might imagine, large carnivores can be very controversial. Some folks want to have the most carnivores we could have on the ground. Other ends of the spectrum would rather see them completely wiped off the landscape. So we kind of have to work with that middle ground and get a better idea of what people know as social carrying capacity. It's a term a little bit different than what us biologists think of when we think of carrying capacity. You know, we think of carrying capacity as being the ability of the landscape to support a certain number or population size of a wild population of animals, whether it's due to habitat or food, cover. Social carrying capacity brings in the human aspect of, well, you might be fine with there being 50 panthers in this area, but I'm not comfortable with that. My social carrying capacity of the animals is lower. And so these kind of last three topics here kind of bring together this whole social political aspect of large carnivore conservation. As you might imagine, it gets very controversial, intertwined. So it can be a challenge to try to work with these animals for a variety of reasons. So just to kind of broad scale show how research works and how it feeds into management, research on large carnivores often will deal with understanding more about the demographics of a population. It's especially important when we're dealing with endangered or threatened species. We model the populations to determine how many of them are going to survive into the future and understand things like risk of extinction, probability of extinction. Those are important information to conserve populations. Genetic variation, understanding how varied a population's genetic base is, can have important ramifications on whether they're going to survive into the future. And then, learning things about how animals select the habitat that they're in. If we know, that a certain species prefers habitat A versus habitat B, then, when we have opportunities to make management decisions on how to manage that land or what lands parcels to purchase, we can do those more effectively for the long-term benefit and recovery of populations that might be endangered or threatened. So you can see, for instance, research feeds into things like decisions on hunting quotas. If a population is being actively hunted, we can determine how many can be taken safely without hurting the population. We can improve a prey base in an area if we know from research that the population's lagging and we need more prey for a large predator. Genetic restoration is a topic I'll get into in great detail today, and about how it's benefited panthers. That particular research project had management implications to where we are today with panthers. And then, of course, protecting habitat, as I mentioned. If you know where they're spending time, you can tailor your protection efforts accordingly. So this is the critter I'll be focusing on today. It's the Florida panther. It's still recognized as a unique subspecies of puma by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So its Latin name is Puma concolorcorii. It's the only breeding population of pumas east of the Mississippi River. Regardless of what you hear up in other parts of the eastern coast, mid-Atlantic areas, there aren't breeding populations of pumas up there. It's solely relegated to Florida. And you can see historically, panthers persisted throughout the southeastern United States. So, all the way from Arkansas down to the tip of the peninsula of Florida. Today, as you might expect, Floridas are roaming across a quite diminished range. About 5% of that historic range is being used by panthers at the moment. So just to give you kind of somewhat real-time data as to where panthers are found in Florida today, this is a compilation of 40 years of data on panthers from telemetry, roadkills, other information. And you can see the vast majority of those points are down here south of the Caloosahatchee River. So this is where our breeding population is, our main breeding population. We have panthers that make it up into central Florida, including areas around Archbold here. Don't let these blue dots fool you. That's just one animal with a GPS collar. So it kind of overstates the presence of animals up there. Certainly we have panthers in central Florida, and we're seeing them more frequently now than we were 10 to 20 years ago. But there's still pretty small population size up there, if you will, in comparison to the core breeding range in South and Southwest Florida. So the history of panthers is kind of follows along the history of large carnivores throughout the world. Basically their populations were stable and healthy up until, the peopling of the southeastern United States, the beginning of development, the loss of habitat, all things which started to reduce the number of panthers. Including among that is also, unregulated take or hunting of panthers. Panthers were considered varmint. In the 1800s, there were bounties on them. And so people were generally fearful of predators. They saw them as competitors. They were going to come eat you in your bed at night, all those kind of things. And so that just perpetuated the mantra of, we need to get rid of these things. The best predator is a dead predator. And so, all those things led over time in years and years in the 1800s and in early 1900s into the middle of last century, where panthers were just continuing to disappear from historic range. And it really wasn't until the state set some guidelines that they afforded some level of protection. They actually were first protected by making them a game animal. So even there were so few of them, just by making them a game species as opposed to varmint, that afforded them some protection during certain times of the year when they couldn't be taken illegally. Subsequent to the state providing them full protection, the federal government came along in 1967, and panthers made this inaugural list of endangered species. So this is the first list from the Federal Register. If you can key in on some of those, you'll see that there's some animals on there that are still on the endangered species list. There are some animals that have hence gone extinct, and there are some animals that have come off this list. So panthers remain endangered today, and they're protected under the Endangered Species Act of 1973, and they're considered endangered again by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Department of Interior. So it was around that time, the early 70s, when the World Wildlife Fund decided to sponsor some surveys in South Florida to see, what kind of population size might be still trying to hang on in Florida. It was pretty much known that the only panthers that were left were probably in South Florida. And so they hired this houndsman from West Texas, Roy McBride, and he brought his hounds over from Texas and spent time down here, lots of time trying to find panthers. And ultimately he treed a few. And so that started to, gain the attention of lawmakers and officials, game and fish officials in Florida, to think that, there's not many of these around. This is an important animal to the ecosystem, and we need to try to find out more. How many are there? Why are there so few? What can we do to try to conserve them? And so after Roy's work here in the 70s, we were fortunate enough to have him stick around. And in 1981 is kind of the first year that FWC initiated research on the Florida Panther and hired Roy McBride as our houndsman, who subsequently stayed with the project until 2019. So we were fortunate to have Roy as part of the project for a long time. And that's because, he had these hounds that were very proficient at capturing panthers in order for us to allow us to radio collar them. And there's a lot of things that have changed on the Panther project over the last 40 years, but one thing that's stayed pretty consistent is how we go about catching them, and that's using these trained hounds. And so I'll just present a portion of a video our agency has put together, which will show you, how we go about catching these animals with trained hounds. So let's see if this works.
Looking for tracks in the dirt at sunrise is only the beginning of the process to collar a Florida Panther. Using ATVs or buggies, dogs with tracking devices, shortwave radio communication, and determination, the Panther team divides and sets out in conditions ranging from a wee bit chilly to mostly scorching with a 100% chance of insects. Sometimes this process can take a few days, but if it's a lucky day, the dogs will find and tree an uncollared panther. The team gathers nearby as the tranquilizer gun is prepared and the veterinarian loads the dart. Radio communication is maintained with the houndsman as the panther is darted.
Now that the dart is in the panther, and it's been a couple minutes, the drugs have started to take effect. We bring the crash bag in. We also have a large cargo net that we stretch out over top of that crash bag, assuming it falls out of the tree. The other thing that can happen is the panther will fall asleep in the tree and actually be stuck up there. That's the point where the tree climber, which is myself, I'll put the climbing spikes on and the safety harness, and I'll climb up the tree.
With a panther's eye view of the waiting net, Mark has to decide whether to tie a rope and lower the cat down, or
ready?
The FWC veterinarian and biologist quickly assess the panther, attaching a collar, inserting a transponder, and tattoo each ear for identification purposes. While the animal is sleeping, they are given IV fluids, vaccinated against a host of diseases, and given an overall health check. When the workup and cleanup is complete, most of the panther team dissolve back into the wild, leaving the panther to wake as the vet watches from a distance, making sure the animal wakes normally.
Okay, so that kind of gives you a perspective. It's always interesting to look at that video, even though I think it's only 10 years old. It looks like we've all aged about maybe 20 years. But yeah, so the early years of the Panther Project, we learned a lot of things about the natural history of panthers, just basically how they were persisting in the subtropical environment of South Florida. But one of the main things we showed was through Roy McBride's minimum counts, these extremely low levels in terms of the population size. So, you know, between 20 and 30 animals were thought to persist on the landscape in South Florida between the 80s and early 1990s. So critically low number of animals, and something which obviously could be potentially bad when it comes to persistence and conservation. So those early data points provided us a lot of information to let us believe that the population was suffering from inbreeding depression as a result of a loss of genetic variation due to that small population size and their isolation from other populations of pumas. And all this can lead to what's termed a vortex of extinction. So those factors kind of compound on each other, and over time, less animals, less genetic variation, less animals, less genetic variation, to the point that that population kind of winks out and goes extinct. And so that's what the kind of agenda was for panthers. It was pretty much assured that, you know, that there was a really good chance that they were going to be lost forever. And some of the things that the scientists were seeing at that point in time in panthers that kind of highlighted that inbreeding was problematic were some of the more infamous correlates of inbreeding you probably have heard of: the kinked tail, the cowlick of fur on the back. These are morphological anomalies, probably don't have a direct impact on the fitness of an animal, but certainly are kind of like harbingers of the fact that they have some genetic variation issues, those particular individuals. Factors that do have a direct impact on fitness would be things like cryptorchidism. So the picture on the left is obviously what we'd like to see when we capture a male panther: 2 testicles descended naturally, normally. But what we were seeing is a proportion of the animals in the population with 1, or in some cases, extreme cases, no testicles descending. So, you know, those animals were effectively, you know, sterile and not providing any reproductive input to the population. So that's obviously problematic. On top of that, the sperm quality of cats is pretty low to begin with. But the sperm quality issues for panthers was even worse, with these defects that they would have, the low concentration, the kinked tails in those sperm cells, all problematic to being a successful reproductive male. Additionally, there were these atrial septal defects. So that's a fancy term for just a hole between the atrial wall and the chambers of the heart. Typically not expected to kill an animal straight out, but you could see how that could have an impact on the circulatory system of an individual. And for an animal that's relying on, you know, bursts of speed to catch large prey, you could see how that would affect an animal over time. Also, these early panthers were shown to have depressed immune systems. And so that made them more susceptible to any of the viruses or other diseases that they might encounter in the wild. So all that data was kind of brought together in this seminal paper back in 1993, just kind of raised the alarm bells, if you will, for the population, in that, you know, if something didn't happen and something didn't happen quick, we were probably going to lose panthers from Florida. And so, as you might imagine, one of the first ideas brought up was, well, why don't we start a captive breeding program? And certainly, you know, those are ideas that have merit. It was somewhat controversial to go out and collect kittens and subadults from the wild and bring them into captivity. It wasn't, you know, some folks on the program weren't very enthusiastic about doing that. Nevertheless, 10 animals were brought into captivity. And it wasn't long thereafter that things started to be figured out that captive breeding was going to pose a lot of challenges Getting animals to breed in captivity is certainly a challenge in and of itself, but raising kittens in captivity and then releasing them in the wild has a lot of problems, especially because those animals often become dependent on their caretakers. So you have to be very careful in that process. And so all those problems combined led to the project being suspended in 1992 in favor of a different option, which had the potential to be implemented much faster than any type of a captive breeding program. And this was the plan for genetic restoration developed here, you can see in 1994. So the idea behind this is to bring animals from a different portion of the species range and bring them into the area where you have inbreeding depression in a small isolated population. And that new genetic material in theory should reinvigorate that population and allow them to expand. And make them, basically healthier. And so with that idea in mind, it's a much quicker response in comparison to captive breeding. It has, of course, the potential in theory to prevent extinction. And there's certainly major conservation ramifications. These kind of projects, especially in large carnivores, hadn't been done at that time. And so, if indeed this was going to work in panthers, even if it didn't, we would learn something and it could potentially be applied to other endangered populations of large carnivores or other species throughout the world. So ramifications there for sure. Now, the idea wasn't without its critics. Some folks brought to mind that there's the potential to have outbreeding depression by bringing in pumas from a different area and dropping them off in the subtropical climate of Florida. Maybe Florida panthers had developed, specific factors that allowed them to survive better in South Florida over millennia. And by bringing in influx of new genes from somewhere like Texas, we might swamp out those local adaptations. So it's a valid criticism, hasn't been documented much in large mammals in the literature, nevertheless something to consider. But the bottom line is that we're in such a dire situation at that point in time that the risk of that occurring, it was worth the risk trying this, even if that was a potential risk to the process. And lastly, people don't really think of it much, but we were doing this in a wild population. So once those animals were brought over and released in the wild, we only really have limited capacity to control things. Genetic restoration, genetic rescue, genetic integration, all kind of the terms interchangeable. Those have been done in laboratory experiments with fruit flies and with, rats, small mammals, but we were going to be doing this in the wild. And so, once those cats were released, it would kind of be we'd have to sit back and see how things went. So that certainly was one of the things that we had to consider. But nevertheless, in 1995, the process went forward. And our houndsman went to West Texas, where he's from, and collected 8 female pumas. The reason West Texas was chosen, as you can see on this map of historic ranges of subspecies of pumas, is that historically there was, interchange probably here between Florida panthers and pumas in Texas. Since they've both been now isolated in the tip of Florida and over here in West Texas, the interchange doesn't occur anymore. So what we'd be doing by implementing this genetic restoration project is basically mimicking what used to occur naturally when those subspecies were more widespread across the landscape. So Roy brought the 8 female Texas pumas over, and we released them at 5 different sites in South Florida. You can see there on that map. 5 of those 8 females reproduced successfully, and we documented a minimum of 20 F1 kittens. And the main thing that shows that this whole program was successful is those F1s subsequently reproduced as well. And so that's really the first, step that showed success. Just a thing to note, one of the myths down in South Florida is that there's still these Texas cougars, Texas mountain lions roaming the wilds of Florida, and they're not really panthers down there anymore. Well, that's not correct. The last female Texas puma was removed from the wild, the few that remained alive at that point in time in 2003. So there are no Texas pumas in the wild in Florida anymore. They're all Florida panthers. So we had kind of a compilation of all this data from genetic restoration that we published in 2010 in this paper here. And it kind of just surmised and reinforced the idea of what we'd known, but with data and analyses that, genetic restoration did play a big role in saving the panther from extinction. I wanted to kind of just build on that a bit because that was 2010, so over a decade ago. And I'm not going to get into great detail into the analytical techniques, but just want to kind of give people some framework of how, well, that's the only word to say it, how awesome this data set is from the perspective of a large carnivore project. There's very few projects that have been ongoing for 40 years. And so we're able to do some pretty neat comparisons. You'll hear me talk about the canonical panthers. Those are the panthers that comprise the population prior to genetic restoration in 1995, those inbred animals with the cryptorchidism, the calyx and kinks, they made up the majority of the population prior to 1995. And then you'll hear me talk about the admixed animals, which make up the majority of the population today. And these are the descendants of those breedings between those Texas females and Florida panthers that occurred after genetic restoration. You'll hear me talk about some of those correlates of inbreeding, how they've changed. And for analyses, we used microsatellite data, which is a type of genetic marker. So just to give you an idea of the data sets that we have over the last 40 years, basically we've radio collared 259 panthers, which to some people doing, wildlife work may not seem like many, but for a large carnivore, that's a lot, never mind one that's endangered. 388 uncollared panthers, those are mainly collected as road mortalities as far back as the 70s, actually. We sampled over 500 kittens at the dens of radio-collared females, and we've genotyped with microsatellites over 900 panthers. We've also collected a lot of location data, whether it's from aerial telemetry or over the last 20 years via the deployment of GPS collars. So just looking quickly at some of the results of the comparisons between those two groups. Again, the canonical panthers are the inbred animals that were mainly on the landscape prior to 1995 versus the admixed animals, which comprise most of the population today. We see that in the post-introgression era, we've seen a reduction in the number of kink tails, significantly so, a significant reduction in the number of calyx. Heterozygosity has significantly increased, so that's a measure of genetic variation in the population. More variation typically means a healthier population. So that's good. Cryptorchidism incidents have gone down significantly. Average number of testicles has gotten closer to 2, and that's something we'd want to see in the population. Atrial septal defects have decreased. And demographic parameters that are of importance to the population, survival estimates for these different groups have all increased when you compare admixed animals to canonical panthers. So all in all, just more information, even with this last 10 years of data that shows a continued benefit to panthers from genetic restoration. I'm not going to get into too much detail on the specifics of these next two figures, but this is just to give you kind of a perspective, a visual perspective on how things have changed. So just think of each one of those bars as an individual panther. The pre-introgression area you can see is pretty homogeneous with the yellow, which is going to be the canonical ancestry in comparison to the mainly admixed ancestry, which is light blue. You see bringing in the Texas females and the F1 generation, and subsequent to that, you see a much more homogeneous population as we move through time of Florida and admixed ancestry. And so I'd make the case, that a population here, which is having inbreeding issues and is very homogeneous in terms of ancestry, is much less healthy than this population here, which is admixed, it has much higher levels of genetic variation. And furthermore, I'd make the case that these animals here are probably more like the animals that historically appeared in Florida when we had extensive, or at least some level of genetic interchange between panthers and other puma populations to the north and to the west towards Texas. So again, kind of just filling out what we wanted to do with genetic restoration. And lastly, of course, a lot of people always say, well, are these still Florida panthers? And that's kind of a debate that'll be ongoing for millennia, probably. But indeed, I would state that they are still Florida panthers. Defining that will be subject of controversy. But if you look at this as a clustering analysis, and basically you can see these circles here are different groups of panthers from different points in time. But the bottom line is they all group out right here together. They're grouped out away from these Western populations and even away from Texas, which you'd expect them to be close to, especially after genetic restoration. So again, we could use this analysis to get a sample and assess whether an animal is a Florida panther or a puma from elsewhere. Those of you that are really paying attention might have noticed these two red dots here and say, well, you know, what's going on there? So this is kind of interesting. These are two animals that were, one of them was illegally shot over on the East Coast in the 1980s. The other one, I believe, was a roadkill on the East Coast. So we still rarely get animals on the East Coast, but even more so back then. Come to find out that genetic analyses have shown that both those animals were not true Florida panthers. They were either Western pumas or from South America. So they you know, culled out and clustered away from the true panthers. And so the analysis worked well in that respect. So the main thing we can say from genetic restoration, probably one of the big things that we're all interested in, is that it indeed did coincide with a subsequent increase in the number of panthers in Florida. So, you know, again, 20 to 30 was the minimum count from Roy in the 80s and early 1990s. To the point today where you can see that subsequent increase right after 1995, where today we believe we probably have in the state somewhere between 120 and 230 panthers in South Florida. So we're in a much better position in terms of conservation, progress towards recovery. You know, things are looking a lot brighter than they were in 1995 when we dropped those female pumas off in South Florida. So I wanted to move on to some conservation challenges facing panthers. You've probably heard of the term umbrella species. Panthers could be seen as an umbrella species just due to the fact that these animals, when they range across the landscape, they really require, you know, huge areas with home ranges up to, you know, potentially several hundreds square miles. So when you're able to protect that amount of habitat for an animal, you're not only obviously protecting that animal itself, but all the other animals that persist on that landscape that don't require so much areas, as well as the plants. Of course, waterways play a role in Florida, and especially our aquifers, and having those remain healthy. If you can keep, you know, a parking lot or a development off an area, it's certainly typically going to help with the drainage issues that we can face in Florida and water quality issues. So panthers are important in that respect. Of course, when it comes to panthers, habitat conservation is priority number one. We can talk about genetics and other things, but certainly all are important when it comes to panther conservation, but habitat's number one. And you know, I always refer to the 3 H's when we talk about the important factors for panther conservation, and their habitat is number one, habitat's number two, and habitat's number three. It's really getting land purchases by some of these county level or state level programs, whether it's something like Conservation Collier down here in core panther habitat, or the Florida Forever program. Getting lands where panthers roam saved in perpetuity are really going to be important for persistence of the animals and for continued population expansion. I can't stress that factor enough. Conservation easements are, of course, also important. And, you know, working with private landowners, of course, as well is very important. Even more so as we talk about the expansion of panthers out of South Florida, where we're fortunate to have, you know, over 1 million acres of public land. Once animals start moving into Central Florida, they aren't afforded that luxury of these huge plots of public land. And so, you know, we're going to have to work diligently with a variety of large private landowners to see if they're willing to, you know, work with trying to keep panthers on the landscape in that area. And so, you know, that's one of those challenges that panthers face. So we recently published this paper in 2019, which kind of gets at some of the other conservation challenges for panthers moving forward. So maintaining genetic diversity is always going to be an issue for panthers because they are isolated from any type of immigration from other puma populations. So future genetic rescue initiatives we showed in this paper are going to be necessary at certain periodic intervals. We continued to show after the science paper in 2010, the improved demographics that the population is still exhibiting from genetic restoration, some 15 years afterwards, still doing well for the most part. And the probability of extinction is at a level that we're comfortable with and that we, over the next 100 years, and that we think show, that panthers continue to head in the right direction if we can make appropriate changes and these genetic rescue initiatives are applied periodically. So again, things look good when we looked at that analysis. Outreach is a vital part of our work now. In fact, we actually have an outreach specialist that we hired that works on the project specifically on panthers. And so, her job is to go around and meet with a variety of different groups, whether it's HOAs or ranchers, private landowners, all kinds of groups, to just kind of inform them and educate people about what you need to do to live, coexist with panthers. We have areas where people have a lot of these, what we call hobby livestock in their backyard in core panther range, and panthers, as the numbers have increased, come into those areas more frequently, and invariably they take some of these animals. And so letting people know how to try to reduce the probability that happen is important. We inform them about programs that might assist them with getting a pen built. And then, of course, in more remote areas where more panthers roam away from the suburbs and exurbs, ranchers have large parcels of land, and they, of course, occasionally lose calves to panthers. And so, there are some compensation programs for smaller run businesses, but it's, something that needs to be contemplated, especially so we can find ways for those types of people with those occupations wanting to coexist and have panthers on their landscape. So it's certainly a big challenge. Okay, I wanted to move on to a more recent study we just started, and it has to do with panthers more in the Archbold section of the world. So as I mentioned earlier, panthers do roam into central Florida, north of the Caloosahatchee River, out of the breeding range. And actually, Roy McBride treed one of his World Wildlife Fund panthers up in Gopher Gully near Fish Eating Creek in 1973. So certainly panthers have been in the area before, as you might expect. But over the next 4 decades, we really didn't document very many panthers north there, and no females were documented since 1973 in central Florida. Never had a kitten hit on the road, never had a female hit on the road. Had males, radio-collared males, disperse out of South Florida into central Florida very infrequently, but it would happen. But overall, females were just not being recorded up there. So, expansion of the breeding range out of South Florida into central Florida is important for panther recovery and the continued recovery of the panther. And so we started some informal kind of camera trapping in the Babcock Ranch area, mainly because it's so proximal to the Caloosahatchee River, and it's kind of one of the foregone conclusions that panthers will probably stop there on their way across the river to the north. And so we started this kind of informal survey in 2014. And so what we gleaned from those early years of having cameras out up there was that, soon enough, we started getting pictures of males, and we expected that. But we started getting pictures of this one animal that was kind of perplexing us all. And of course, big debate and, joking back and forth of, it wasn't really a female, it was a cryptorchid male. And it's very hard to positively identify the sex in a lot of these photographs. But the evidence kept building, and ultimately, not only were the photographs starting to be more diagnostic, but then we got tracks that fit the size of a female panther. But really, the catch-all, the end-all is when you see an animal traveling with kittens, like you see here. Then that that's a female And so we documented not only the first female since 1973 in 2016, so that was a pretty momentous event for panther conservation, but subsequently, documented a litter with kittens, 3 kittens up at Babcock Ranch. So very momentous occasion. Unfortunately, with continued monitoring, we didn't note that we believe strongly that these kittens likely did not survive and weren't recruited into the population. And so for recovery and breeding to occur north of the river, we have to have that generation get into the population and breed themselves. And so we don't believe that happened with these litters. Why, we can't say at this point in time. So that led to the conclusion that we needed to spend a bit more effort and perhaps do a more standardized assessment of the presence of panthers in Central Florida. And so in March 2019, we expanded that trail camera network extensively in Central Florida. And this allowed us to have a better coverage, of course, and then we could quantify our effort a lot better. And so that kind of data that we would get from these cameras would be much more informative and allow us to do some different analyses. We did implement an adaptive process when, if we were lucky enough to get a picture of a female and a female with kittens, we would place more cameras in that area just in hopes of getting some more information. But bottom line is we were interested in male panthers, obviously females, mating events, breeding events, offspring, if we get pictures of kittens. And then kind of a thing I'll mention at the end too is also the presence absence of the neurological disorder I'll talk about in a second at the end of the talk. But these cameras do allow us, especially the video cameras that are out there, to document if this condition is occurring in Central Florida. So just to look at some of the data that we've collected north of the river since March of 2019. So you can see about a year and 3 months of data, placed 112 different cameras, over 30,000 trap nights. Brian Kelly, who's kind of taken the lead on this project, he's cataloged a lot of images till his eyes are probably getting ready to come out of his head. But it's a lot of work. The fun part is putting out the cameras. It's going through all that footage is what's a bit mind-numbing and takes time. So nonetheless, you can see been successful at getting a good number of panther images and independent detections. And amongst those mostly male animals, we have documented 3 females over the last year and a half, and 1 kitten, which you can see down here. We just know from that spotting pattern that that's an older kitten. But again, we didn't get pictures of what we believe was the original Babcock female. We kind of have our doubts that she's still around. And so even with mating events occurring up there and the documentation of this kitten, again, we didn't see any kind of recruitment or subsequent pictures of kittens up there. And so again, a bit of a mystery as to why that is. With the coverage that we have, we expect that we probably would have at least gotten a few more pictures of litters. The one issue is that, we're mainly restricted to deployment of our cameras on public land. And so since there's much less public land up there, we may be missing, obviously, and we know we're missing panthers and perhaps litters in some areas. So just a quick comparison of the data we collected to date in Central Florida versus camera studies we've done in South Florida, where there's a lot more panthers. You can see that, in terms of detections, 96% of our cameras in South Florida, where we've done these studies, document panthers, and about half of that do in Central Florida. So just a much more sporadic distribution. Same things with number of detections per 100 trap days. It's just lower. And, that makes sense given we know that panthers are existing at lower densities up there. So the future of Central Florida research, the project continues. We may want to do something where we focus more on areas now where we have documented females, to see if we can get some more information on successful breeding attempts and kittens. And again, as I mentioned before, public lands make up such a small portion of the landscape up there that building more communications and bridges and outreach with private landowners in this area is would pay dividends in terms of documenting females and the breeding that's occurring in this area. So that's certainly something we're interested in trying moving forward. Okay, so that was pretty much all the good news. Like I say, I don't want to end on a sour note, but I do want to end on a cautionary note when it comes to panther conservation. I think this condition merits it. You know, in 2017, we started getting video clips from citizen scientists, which showed panthers having some issues with their hind legs, hind limbs. Ataxia is the term for it. And so I termed this talk I gave at the Wildlife Society last month, A Hitch in the Road to Recovery, Documentation of a Neuromuscular Disorder in Florida Panthers. And so it was, you know, disease threats to any endangered species are nothing new, and it's nothing new with panthers. We've had this happen before. We had a feline leukemia outbreak in the early parts of the 2000s. Which impacted and resulted in the loss of some animals. Feline leukemia is spread to panthers from domestic cats. They eat one, they get the disease, the virus, and they die rather quickly from that virus. So it's a potential threat to an animal that persists at very low numbers. Pseudorabies is something we've become more and more interested in over time. And you know, this is a virus that's shed by feral hogs. Doesn't usually kill the hogs, but when a panther takes down one of their favorite prey and eats them, and if they get infected with that virus, they again also, as was suspected for this animal here, die from pseudorabies rather quickly. So this feline leukomyelopathy, as we term it, FLM, is a neurological disorder that affects the neural cells in the spine and the brain and leads to this hind limb weakness, discoordination that you'll see here. And again, this was provided to us initially by a citizen scientist that had his cameras out at the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary in Collier County. And he shared this with us. And when we first saw it, and you probably, you know, this first kitten you kind of know seems to have a little bit of a swagger in his back legs. It catches our attention, having looked at a lot of these videos. But you'll see when his sibling comes along, he's obviously having a lot of issues maintaining his balance and moving his back legs. And so, you know, if you're a predator that's going to be relying on bursts of speed to catch deer and hogs and anything else, you could see how that condition is going to have a severe impact on how long that animal is possibly going to survive in the wild. So, you know, when we got that video, it kind of got our attention, and quickly from the same area, we started to get videos of bobcats exhibiting the same conditions, and things kind of just snowballed from there in terms of the information we started to receive. We put out a press release. More and more citizens started sending us videos. You know, most of them were not what we thought would be FLM, but certainly some videos came in that were from animals we believe possibly had FLM. So a lot of help from the public on this has come in. You know, we've documented this now and confirmed it in several panthers and 2 panthers. The only issue with confirming FLM is that you have to do a necropsy to confirm it. So we can only do that on dead animals or animals that have to be euthanized. But we can note probable cases from video and as you saw there. So bottom line is, over time, since 2018, we started to see more and more cases pop up in our 2 wild felids in Florida. And so as of August 2020, we've had 40 cases documented in Florida. 9 of those confirmed, 31 probable. And the area that we like to call the hot zone is the Corkscrew Swamp ecosystem, mainly in Collier County. And you can see in that map there the panther and bobcat cases that we've documented over time. Typically, most of the cases originally were kind of centered upon areas that we would qualify as being in the urban wildland interface here. But what's more concerning is over the past summer in 2020, we've seen these cases out here in the middle of Big Cypress, far removed from the urban or developed areas. And so it just makes us wonder, well, you know, how widespread is this condition in the population? And so there's a need to increase our monitoring efforts into these areas to get a feel for what portion of the population might actually be affected by this condition. And then just a range-wide map for Florida, you can see that we've documented bobcats, all the way up to almost Jacksonville with FLM, including confirmed case in Gainesville. So we believe that this condition is statewide in our wild felids, and it may even be in other parts of the Southeast. We just don't know. But bottom line is it's not restricted to panthers and it's not restricted to South Florida. So leading suspected causes, we don't believe that it's congenital. And the main reason we can say that is because we're seeing it in two different species. If it was just in panthers, that would certainly be a plausible suspected cause. We don't think it's tick paralysis after further contemplation and testing. Nutritional deficiencies are something that are still on the table. But at this point in time, the tests that's been done haven't shown up anything remarkable in terms of the diet that might be affecting the panthers and the bobcats. Infectious diseases are obviously always going to be considered, and I've talked about several of these. There's also canine distemper virus and feline parvo virus and other viruses, but they've all shown up as negative so far in the tests we've done. So there's no evidence of infection on the histological testing that we've done on these samples from FLM positive animals. Toxins, of course, come in as an idea of a possible culprit here. Pesticides, excuse me, they're obviously widespread in the environment. You may have heard about incidences out west where rodenticides, especially these bromethalin-based rodenticides, have impacted mountain lions in California and can cause issues. So that's still, thought of as a potential cause. Insecticides are widespread in the environment down here. There's aerial spraying in Collier County. If for those of you that aren't from Florida that might be on the talk here, we actually have an elected position that deals with mosquito control in Collier County. So we take things seriously down here when it comes to mosquitoes, but we also probably dump a lot of chemicals on the landscape in doing so. Herbicides, are something that are extensively used, especially in South Florida, to try to control the exotic species that are down here. And so is that potentially, or a change in that mixture, having some kind of impact, maybe secondarily on panthers or on prey that feed in these areas where this chemicals are been applied? And natural toxins, you can't rule those out either. So a lot of unknowns, we certainly have things to focus on, but coming up with an answer is kind of priority one moving forward, just given the fact that we know that this has the potential to negatively impact an endangered species. So I don't want to end on a sour note. The main point of my talk was the great progress that we've made over the last 40 years, going from those 20 to 30 animals to about 120 to 230 today. We're seeing that expansion into Central Florida and breeding. So those are all good signs, just with the cautionary tale that this FLM is something we need to monitor closely, just to ensure that, we have Florida panthers on the landscape for generations to come. And that's our goal, moving forward. So just with that, I'd want to wrap up with providing a few links. These will probably be a bit quick, but you can Google them to get more information on panthers from our FWC website. That first link, if you are a Floridian and you have sightings, or you just want to have fun with us and submit a sighting from Pennsylvania, you can go to that website and do that. Tips for any kind of mischievous activities you might see related to panthers can be sent to that number. And I just wanted to highlight really quick our Protect the Panther plate. So many of you know we have hundreds of specialty plates in Florida. And so the Panther plate has been around for a while, since the early 90s, late 80s, I believe. And basically, people who have these plates, each time they renew their registration, they pay a $25 donation, basically, that goes to the Panther Research and Management Trust Fund. And almost all of our salaries and expense money and research money, basically, on panthers at the state level comes from those Protect the Panther plates. We don't use almost any general revenue at all. So it's really been a successful program. It's shown, I think, how supportive Floridians are of their state animal. And so we're really appreciative for all the folks that continue to buy these tags and support panther conservation and their panther. And so with that, like to thank all the folks on this slide here for their assistance with all the data, all the past and present members of the Panther team that have been irreplaceable part of the research and management we've done. And hopefully I haven't bored you all as much as I bored FP 119 here. He's heard all this before. And so with that, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you guys might have.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. I certainly wasn't bored. I was really focused on what you were saying, and it was wonderful to get a 40-year perspective. So thank you very much for that. And we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A, so maybe I can feed them into you.
Okay.
And I'm going to start from the bottom and work back up, because some of the earlier questions were answered a little bit later in your talk, especially the ones on the admixed genetic basis. So I'll start off with a question from John Fitzpatrick, who's a board member here and was the former director at Archbold. So is FLM known elsewhere around the ranges of North American native cats?
Yeah, we haven't had any reports from outside of Florida for what we've been terming FLM. Now, there's been some condition in captive cheetahs, especially over in Europe, that seems very similar to what we're observing here. And, you know, the histology that we've done looks similar to what they found in captive animals over in Europe, I believe was where most of them came from. But yeah, we haven't, we've certainly, you know, our veterinarians are very in tune and much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but they're working with experts from across the country and around the world. So we've put out the word, you know, that if people do come across footage of a cat, bobcat or puma anywhere, that, you know, we'd love to see it, because even though you can't confirm it as being FLM, we've seen enough of these videos now where we can start to say, you know, there's probably a pretty good case that that animal has this condition.
So I guess there might be a quick follow-up to that. Has it ever been seen in domestic felines, in house cats?
No, we've had reports from you know, local animal shelters where because they've seen this in the news and stuff, and yeah, it just hasn't popped up yet as being something in the domestic cats.
So a question from Scott Ward here, on a landscape scale, and I'm thinking particularly as you go from South Florida to sort of around here at Archbold, are there particular types of land use or sort of combinations of land covers that panthers seem to avoid altogether?
Well, besides places like downtown Sebring, they're yeah, I mean, you know, they are more generalists than we want to give them credit for. So, you know, they'll use open marshes, they'll use old fields, they'll use pastures, but they do need that cover. So they really like those palmetto patches. They like thick oak hammocks. So they need to have some of that kind of cover on the landscape as well. But let's, you know, make no doubts about it. Pumas are very adaptable when you can see that they range from the Yukon all the way to Patagonia, you know, the most widespread mammal, I believe, in the Western Hemisphere. So they can adapt, but, you know, when humans start to intermingle too much, that's when we can run into problems.
Yeah, and obviously the density of road is an issue as well.
Yes.
Question from Raoul Boughton. Are there any differences in the morphology of Florida admixed panthers after genetic rescue? I get that question regularly.
Yep. Yeah, so we did some work on this with cranial morphology, which is, you know, obviously subject to controversy, but, you know, the original way that panthers were defined as panthers was using a variety of measures, but included among these was cranial measurements. And so we did a study that included a limited set of canonical Texas and admixed skulls with some folks out of University of Florida. And, you know, come to show that the admixed animals are still different from Texas and still line up with the canonical animals. So certainly you want to take those findings with a grain of caution, because people tend to lean more on genetics now when it comes to delineating subspecies, or I'm not saying morphometrics don't have a place, but nevertheless, that analysis was to kind of get at Raul's question, which is, you know, we still do see a difference between the panthers in Florida, whether admixed or canonical, versus those Texas pumas.
Okay, I think you've probably answered either during your talk or right there the rest of the canonical versus the admixed genotypes. So I'm going to move on to another question, which was, what is the federal recovery target?
Yeah, so currently the federal recovery plan, which we have, states that in order to downlist to threatened, we need to have 2 populations of 230 animals or more. I'm sorry, 240 animals or more. I should know that by heart. Yeah. So it's, you know, we have what we consider now one population that's 120 to 230. So we're not even at one population that would meet the requirement to work towards downlisting to threatened. So yeah, you know, there's obviously interest by some folks to try to get panther populations started elsewhere, whether it's, you know, certainly good habitat up in North Florida. The prey base between hog and deer is maybe even better than down here in some of those areas. But, you know, the socio-political controversies that I got at the beginning of the talk are hurdles to just going up and releasing a large predator up in North Florida. You know, studies have been done like that before by the agency, and, you know, they were met with some roadblocks, as you might expect. Now, you know, it's been 30 years. Have mindsets changed a bit? I don't know. We'd have to see, but certainly something that warrants consideration for the long-term persistence of panthers. It would help to have a second population.
So I think that answered John Fitzpatrick's question, was, you know, about the sentiments of releasing panthers, particularly under private land. So thank you. Yep. I'm going to ask a simple question. The shape of the spread north of the Caloosahatchee River suggests a single crossing point. This is often a point of interest. Was it a bridge?
Well, the actual dispersal zone that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife qualifies on the map is not at a bridge. It's near those Ortona locks there. But yeah, I don't doubt that panthers are crossing anywhere else. They're not afraid to swim across the ditch. It's kind of narrow in some areas. Whether they've used the bridge to get a bridge here or there to get across has been brought up before. I wish we could answer that, or the toll bridge keeper could get a picture of one going by at 2 a.m. but yeah, I wouldn't rule anything out with these guys. They're pretty adaptable and figure things out, but certainly just hopping in the river and swimming across is easy enough for them, and especially in certain kind of points where the river thins down isn't very wide. So. Okay.
So I'm going to try and convey this question, which was transferred from someone watching on Facebook, and it's really it's a biogeography question. So hopefully I'll get it. So, is there a phylogeny-based phylogeographic work into the relationships between all the panther subspecies and populations? Is there a biogeographical basis to it? Additionally, do these analyses include any paleo DNA from extirpated species, especially Eastern North America? So good luck with that question.
Yeah, there's certainly been a variety of studies. Kind of the seminal work on this question was done by Melanie Culver and published, you know, now 2 decades in 2000, where she took puma samples from across the range, basically most of North America, Florida, Central, and then a lot of the animals in South America, to get at that question of the interrelation. You saw that one map I had from the 1940s from Young, that, you know, had, I think, 15 different subspecies in North America. Well, you know, that's questionable, obviously, using today's science with genetics versus what we're using. So that has been done, and that's where the controversy arises, is that is the panther really a distinct subspecies? And so like I say, in terms of the Fish and Wildlife Service that lists them as threatened or endangered, then they are still a unique subspecies. But the science and the genetics shows, you know, that more than likely we don't have 15 subspecies in North America. We may just have 1. So how does that fit into then conserving panthers? Okay. Well, And that's when I'd get into that genetic data that I showed that even if they are not a distinct subspecies and all the oddities that go along with calling a subspecies, when we talk about mammals, it's not hard science in a lot of cases. We can show with that analysis, those clustering analyses, especially, that those animals, because of their genotype, still cluster away from other populations of pumas in North America. And so that, in a sense, makes them a distinct population segment.
Great. And I'm going to ask two unrelated questions at once. They're both quick, and then we should probably wrap up, even though there are more waiting in the wings. So the two last questions I was going to pose to you is, why is it predominantly males who travel north? And then the second question, unrelated, is, has there been any impact of pythons on panthers and their survivorship?
Yeah, so the main reason we see the males move north is just when males disperse, they disperse farther than females in most cases. So they're going to be the ones that are going to be most likely to cross the river. They get into competition as soon as they leave mom with the resident male. They don't want any part of that. That's going to usually lead to their demise if they stick around. So they start to move. And, you know, over time, as the population has increased to the south, it makes sense that some are going to try to move to the north. And then when they get up there, they typically roam far and wide because they can't find females. But that's why we mainly have seen males up there until just recently. It takes longer for females to get the gumption to make that kind of a move. As far as pythons, you know, the verdict is still out. You've seen the studies. Okay. You know, mesomammal populations have dropped in Everglades National Park, and certainly a python, if it came across a panther den, would have no problem just you know, gulping down those kittens like gumdrops. So it's certainly something to be of concern, as well as with the fact that, you know, they do take down deer, which is a prey item of panthers. Mm-hmm. So the potential is there for them to have an impact on Florida panthers.
Okay, so I'm just going to share from all of us online. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody. There's still 61 people online, which is pretty impressive. So thank you everyone who joined us. And I am just conveying a thunderous round of applause to you. I know everyone online here really enjoyed this seminar. And we're looking forward to working with you. And thank you for paying a little bit of homage to our area, letting us focus in on the lands around Archbold, because that made it a really special seminar for us. So we really appreciate it. So thanks, everybody.